Take it up with my lawyers. You already lost. Come on. Enjoy your water while you still can, because tomorrow, I'll own the source.
I watched an arrogant HOA president bulldoze my family's pasture to steal water for his luxury golf course, hiding behind a dirty legal loophole. He thought a dirt-poor rancher couldn't fight a millionaire's lawyers. He was wrong. I didn't sue him. I just bought the mountain and turned off his tap. The smell of diesel fuel and freshly torn earth is something that belongs on a construction site, not in the middle of a third-generation cattle ranch. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in October when I rode my gelding, Buster, up the eastern ridge of my property. My grandfather had bought this land in Oak Haven, Colorado, back in the 50s, long before the urban sprawl of Denver started creeping up the valley. For decades, it was just us, the pines, and the cattle. Then came Whispering Pines Estates. It was a sprawling, gated community of McMansions, manicured lawns, and an 18-hole championship golf course that demanded more water than a small city. We shared a property line, separated only by a rusted barbed wire fence and a dense line of ancient oak trees. I kept to myself, and I expected them to do the same. But as I crested the hill that morning, my blood ran cold. A massive yellow excavator was tearing a jagged 5-foot-deep trench straight through my lower grazing pasture. 3 dump trucks were lined up, idling heavily, while a crew of men in high-visibility vests dragged massive, black PVC pipes into the wound they had just cut into my land. My cattle were huddled in the far corner of the pasture, terrified by the noise. They had completely crushed 50 yards of my fencing to get their equipment inside. I spurred Buster into a gallop, roaring down the hill. I practically threw myself out of the saddle before the horse even came to a complete stop, storming right up to the foreman. "Shut it down!" I screamed over the roar of the diesel engines. "Shut these machines down right now. You are trespassing on private property." The foreman, a burly guy with the name Hank stitched onto his jacket, signaled the excavator operator to kill the engine. He looked at me, completely unbothered, and pulled a clipboard from his truck. "You Arthur Pendleton?" Hank asked, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto my torn-up grass. "You're damn right I am, and you have exactly 3 minutes to get these machines off my land before I call the sheriff and press charges for destruction of property." I fumed, my hands shaking with a mix of adrenaline and pure rage. Hank just chuckled, handing me a thick stack of stapled papers. "Call whoever you want, buddy. We have a court-ordered right-of-way." "I'm just doing the job I was contracted to do by the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." I snatched the papers. The legal jargon blurred before my eyes, but a few words stood out like neon signs: emergency utility easement, injunction, and Whispering Pines HOA. Before I could even process the absolute absurdity of a suburban HOA claiming an easement on a private ranch, a sleek, silver Mercedes SUV bumped its way across my ruined pasture, bottoming out in the ruts the dump trucks had left behind. Out stepped Richard Covington. Richard was the newly elected president of the Whispering Pines HOA. He was a man who wore tailored suits to the grocery store and spoke to everyone as if they were slightly slow children. He adjusted his expensive sunglasses, stepping carefully over a clod of dirt, as if it might infect his imported leather loafers. "Arthur, good morning," Richard called out, a sickeningly sweet smile plastered on his perfectly tanned face. "I see my crew has already brought you up to speed." "Richard, what the hell is this?" I demanded, marching up to him and shoving the paperwork into his chest. "You are trenching a massive pipe through my best grazing land. You don't own this." Richard sighed, adopting a look of mock sympathy. "Actually, Arthur, we have a legal right to transit. If you read the documents, which I know can be a bit dense, you'd see that back in 1972, your grandfather signed a municipal utility easement allowing the county to lay emergency transit lines through the eastern corridor of this parcel." "For the county," I shouted. "For emergency public utilities, not for a private subdivision." Well, that's where the law gets deliciously nuanced. Richard smirked. Whispering Pines was recently incorporated as a private utility district to manage our own resources. Our golf course is dying, Arthur. The county water restrictions are suffocating us. We found a natural spring up in the mountains, and the only logical route to pipe it down to our reservoir is through this old easement. The judge agreed. The injunction prevents you from interfering with our infrastructure. I was hyperventilating. You went to a judge behind my back? You didn't even serve me notice. We published a notice in the county ledger 30 days ago, as legally required. Richard countered smoothly. Not my fault. You don't read the financial section of the local paper. Now, if you'll excuse me, we have a schedule to keep. If you try to stop my men, you'll be in contempt of a court order. He got back into his Mercedes and drove away, leaving me standing in the middle of a torn-up field, clutching a piece of paper that had effectively stolen my land. I spent the next 3 weeks in a desperate, exhausting legal battle. I hired Thomas Abernathy, a gritty local lawyer who specialized in land disputes. We filed emergency motions, cease and desist orders, and appeals. But Richard Covington had weaponized the HOA's massive legal fund. They tied us up in procedural delays, burying Thomas in paperwork. While we fought in the courtroom, Richard's crews worked double shifts. I had to watch, helpless, as they laid thousands of feet of massive pipe directly through my property. They buried it, half-assedly threw some cheap grass seed over the dirt scars, and patted themselves on the back. My pasture was ruined. The heavy machinery had compacted the soil so badly that nothing would grow properly for years. By the time the pipeline was operational, it was midsummer. Oakhaven was hit with a brutal drought. The county banned all non-essential watering. My cattle were struggling, the local creeks were running dry, and my neighbors were letting their lawns turn brown, but not Whispering Pines. Every evening, I would stand on my ridge and look down at their subdivision. It was an oasis of sickening emerald green. Their golf course sprinkler systems ran for hours every single night, blasting millions of gallons of crystal-clear mountain water into the air, all of it flowing through the stolen trench beneath my feet. Richard Covington had won. He had used a dirty legal trick to bypass the drought and turn my property into his personal plumbing system. The anger inside me didn't fade. It crystallized. I couldn't beat their lawyers in a fight over the easement. But sitting on my porch one night, watching the sprinklers gleam in the moonlight, a singular, dangerous question popped into my head. Where, exactly, was all that water coming from? Finding the source of the water became my obsession. Richard had vaguely mentioned a natural spring up in the mountains, but I knew the geography of Oakhaven better than anyone. Most of the mountain springs fed directly into the municipal reservoir or were fiercely protected by state conservation laws. You couldn't just tap a mountain spring because you wanted your putting greens to look pretty. I drove into town and met Thomas Abernathy at his cluttered office. It smelled like stale coffee and old paper. Thomas, I need to know where the HOA is drawing the water from, I said, slamming my hands on his desk. The easement covers the transit of the water through my land, but what about the source? If they are illegally tapping a protected waterway, we can get the EPA to shut them down. Thomas rubbed his tired eyes. Arthur, I've looked into it. The source is a place called Clearwater Basin, about 7 miles up the mountain. It's not municipal, and it's not state protected. Then who owns it? I pressed. Thomas pulled a thick manila folder from a stack. That's the crazy part. It's privately owned. Back in the 1890s, the entire basin was bought by a corporation called Creston Mining. They were looking for silver, found nothing but a massive underground aquifer. They went bankrupt in the 1980s. I frowned, trying to connect the dots. If the company went bankrupt, the state would seize the land. Usually, yes, Thomas explained, leaning forward. But Creston Mining's assets were wrapped up in a bizarre, decades-long trust dispute between the founders' heirs. The land has been sitting in legal limbo for 40 years. It's essentially a ghost parcel. Richard Covington's engineers must have found the aquifer, realized no one was actively managing the land, and just quietly installed a pump station. They're technically stealing water from a dead corporation. A spark of hope ignited in my chest. Can we report them for theft? To who? Thomas sighed. The heirs don't even know they own it. The state won't intervene unless a property owner files a complaint. Richard knows this. It's brilliant, honestly. He found a victimless crime that keeps his golf course green. I wasn't going to accept that. I left Thomas's office and drove straight to the county archives. I enlisted the help of Martha Higgins, a 70-year-old retired librarian who knew more about the county's history than the mayor. For 3 agonizing days, Martha and I sifted through property deeds, tax records, and bankruptcy filings from the 1980s. Finally, Martha pulled a dusty ledger from the back room. She slammed it onto the table, her eyes wide behind her thick glasses. "Arthur, look at this." She pointed a trembling finger at a tax delinquency notice. The trust managing Creston Mining's assets finally dissolved 6 months ago. The heirs settled for cash payouts. Because the property taxes on Clearwater Basin haven't been paid in 40 years, the county just quietly moved the 40-acre parcel to a closed delinquent tax auction to recoup the debt. My heart hammered against my ribs. A closed auction? Who can bid? Anyone who pays the outstanding back taxes, Martha grinned, a wicked glint in her eye. "Arthur, the land isn't worth much on paper because it's completely inaccessible by road, and you can't build on it due to the slope. The back taxes owed for the last 40 years amount to exactly $214,000. I stared at the number. $214,000. It was an astronomical sum for a rancher. It was my entire life savings, plus the emergency fund, plus a massive line of credit against the ranch itself. If I did this, I would be entirely broke. If a cattle disease hit, or if beef prices dropped, I would lose the Pendleton Ranch forever. But I thought about Richard Covington's smug face. I thought about the torn earth, the broken fences, and the sheer, arrogant entitlement of a man who thought he could walk all over me because I wore boots instead of a suit. "Martha, when does the auction close?" "Tomorrow at noon," she replied. I didn't sleep that night. I was at the bank the moment the doors unlocked at 8 a.m. I sat in the manager's office, sweating through my shirt, as I leveraged everything I owned. My grandfather's tractor, the herd, the very dirt my house sat on. The bank manager thought I was insane, warning me about the extreme financial risk, but I signed the papers with a steady hand. At 11:15 a.m., I walked into the county clerk's office with a certified cashier's check for $214,000. The clerk, a bored-looking young man, blinked at the check. "You're paying off the Creston parcel. We haven't had a bid on that in ever." "I am paying the delinquent taxes in full, claiming the deed, and transferring ownership to Arthur Pendleton," I said, sliding my ID across the counter. The next 45 minutes were the longest of my life. I stood at the counter, watching the clock tick toward noon, terrified that Richard Covington or one of his lawyers would walk through the door and outbid me. Every time the office door opened, I flinched, but no one came. Richard was too busy golfing, completely unaware that his stolen water supply was currently up for sale. At 12:01 p.m., the clerk stamped a heavy seal onto a stack of documents. "Congratulations, Mr. Pendleton," the clerk said, sliding the deed across the counter. "You are now the sole owner of Clearwater Basin." I picked up the deed. The paper felt heavy, vibrating with power. I didn't just own a useless piece of rocky mountain. I owned the aquifer. I owned the spring. I owned the very source of the water that flowed through the pipeline Richard had forced onto my land. I stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun, pulled out my cell phone, and called Thomas Abernathy. "Thomas," I said, a massive grin spreading across my face. "Draft a letter to the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Let them know they are trespassing on private property, and their water rights are hereby revoked. Arthur, Thomas gasped over the line. Did you actually do it? I bought the mountain, Thomas, I laughed, walking toward my truck. Now, I'm going to go buy some bolt cutters. It's time to turn off the tap. The drive up to Clearwater Basin required an old logging road that hadn't seen maintenance since the Reagan administration. I threw my heavy-duty bolt cutters, a solid steel masterlock padlock, a spool of heavy-gauge logging chain, and my freshly minted property deed into the passenger seat of my beat-up Ford F-250. My dog, a blue heeler named Boomer, rode shotgun, hanging his head out the window as we bounced over the treacherous terrain. The road ended about a mile from the basin. From there, it was a steep hike through dense lodgepole pines. When I finally broke through the tree line, I saw it. Clearwater Basin was a stunning natural depression in the granite, holding a massive, crystal-clear pool fed by deep subterranean springs. But ruining the pristine landscape was exactly what I had expected. A massive, industrial-grade pumping station sitting right on the water's edge. It was a blatant, illegal installation. A high-capacity diesel generator powered a commercial water pump, which was currently humming loudly, sucking thousands of gallons of water directly out of my basin and forcing it down the mountain through an underground PVC pipe. They had poured a concrete slab, erected a chain-link fence around the equipment, and even bolted a sign to the gate that read, "Property of Whispering Pines Utility District, authorized personnel only." I couldn't help but laugh out loud. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. I grabbed my bolt cutters and snapped the cheap padlock on the chain-link gate. It gave way with a satisfying crack. I walked right up to the main control panel of the diesel generator. I didn't just hit the kill switch. I pulled the main breaker, completely disabling the electrical feed to the massive pump. The loud hum died instantly, replaced by the peaceful sound of wind whistling through the pines. Then, I wrapped my heavy-duty logging chain around the pump's main intake valve and the generator cage, securing it with the master lock. I took a thick, black Sharpie and wrote directly on the HOA's metal sign, "New ownership. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. Arthur Pendleton." The effect on the Whispering Pines subdivision was almost instantaneous. With the brutal Colorado summer heat baking the valley, an 18-hole golf course requires constant, aggressive hydration to survive. Without the millions of gallons flowing from the mountain, the deep, rich emerald grass began to bake. By day 2, the putting greens were losing their luster. By day 3, the fairways were turning a brittle, sickly yellow. By day 4, my phone started ringing. I was out in the barn, greasing the axles on my John Deere tractor, when I heard the crunch of gravel in my driveway. I walked out to find Richard Covington's silver Mercedes SUV parked haphazardly near my porch. Richard marched toward me, flanked by Hank, the burly foreman from the pipeline crew, and a local Oak Haven sheriff's deputy named Miller. Richard's face was the color of a bruised plum. His usual cool, arrogant demeanor was completely gone. "Arrest him, deputy!" Richard screamed, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. This lunatic hiked up to our municipal pump station, vandalized our equipment, and illegally cut off the water supply to our entire district. Deputy Miller, a guy I had known since high school, looked uncomfortable. "Arthur, Mr. Covington here, says you tampered with utility infrastructure. That's a felony. Tell me you didn't do something stupid." I wiped my greasy hands on a rag and smiled. "I didn't tamper with any utility infrastructure, deputy. I secured my own private property." "It's a municipal spring," Richard shouted, spit flying from his lips. "We have the rights to that water. You are costing us tens of thousands of dollars a day in landscaping damages." "Actually, Richard, you don't have the rights to anything," I said calmly. I walked over to the porch, grabbed a thick manila envelope I had left sitting on the railing, and handed it to Deputy Miller. "Take a look at that, Miller. It's a certified, notarized deed from the Oak Haven County Clerk. As of 3 days ago, I am the sole owner of the 40-acre parcel known as Clearwater Basin, which includes all subterranean and surface water rights." Deputy Miller scanned the document. His eyebrows shot up to his hairline. He looked at Richard, then back at me, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Well, Mr. Covington," Deputy Miller said, handing the deed back to me, "looks like Arthur here owns the mountain. If your equipment is on his land without a lease agreement, he has every right to shut it down." "That's impossible." Richard snatched the deed out of my hand, his eyes scanning the legal jargon frantically. "That land was locked in a trust. It wasn't for sale. It was for sale at a delinquent tax auction," I corrected him, stepping into his personal space. "An auction you would have known about if you read the financial section of the local paper." "Isn't that what you told me about the easement?" Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He stared at the deed, the reality of the situation finally crashing down on him. "You listen to me," Richard hissed, dropping the paper. "You think this is over? We have an easement through your ranch. The pipe is already in the ground. We will sue you for everything you own to get that water flowing again." "Go ahead," I challenged, crossing my arms. "But until a judge tells me otherwise, the tap stays off. Now, get off my property before I have the deputy here cite you for trespassing." Richard glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. He spun on his heel and stormed back to his Mercedes, Hank trailing awkwardly behind him. As they drove off, kicking up a cloud of dust, I felt a massive surge of triumph. But as Thomas Abernathy had warned me, cornered animals are the most dangerous, and I had just backed a multi-million-dollar HOA into a very expensive corner. The retaliation was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours of shutting off the pump, Thomas Abernathy's fax machine practically caught fire from the sheer volume of legal threats pouring in from Whispering Pines' high-priced corporate law firm, Sterling and Vance. Wait, no, let's call them Carmichael, Roth, and Zane. They weren't just suing me to turn the water back on. They were attempting to bleed me dry through legal attrition. They filed a massive civil suit in the district court, demanding immediate restoration of water flow under a bizarre, archaic doctrine called water rights by prior appropriation. Their lead attorney, a slick, shark-eyed man named Winston Carmichael, argued that because the HOA had tapped the abandoned spring first and put the water to beneficial use, they had established a legal claim over it, regardless of who bought the land later. The defendant, Arthur Pendleton, maliciously purchased said property with the sole, vindictive intent of disrupting an established municipal utility. We demand emergency injunctive relief and compensatory damages in the amount of $450,000 for landscaping replacement. Excerpt from the HOA's emergency injunction filing. I was terrified. I had spent every dime I had buying the basin. I couldn't afford to fight a drawn-out legal war against a corporate firm that billed $1,000 an hour. Thomas worked pro bono, burning the midnight oil, but we were outgunned. To make matters worse, the HOA started playing dirty outside the courtroom. They couldn't touch my water, but they controlled the property line. They hired surveyors to find microscopic infractions. They claimed a portion of my barn's roof overhang crossed their airspace by 3 inches and filed a zoning complaint with the city. They stationed private security guards at the edge of the easement, shining industrial spotlights into my bedroom windows every night under the guise of pipeline security. The stress was agonizing. I was losing sleep. My cattle were restless from the constant spotlight harassment, and the bank was calling me daily, nervous about the legal jeopardy surrounding my newly acquired, heavily leveraged mountain parcel. Then, about 2 weeks into the legal bloodbath, we caught the break that changed everything. I was sitting in Thomas's office, reviewing a stack of the HOA's financial disclosures that Thomas had subpoenaed during discovery. We were looking for proof that they had the funds to actually maintain the pipeline. But the numbers weren't adding up. "Thomas, look at this ledger," I said, tapping my finger on a line item buried on page 47. Revenue source: Oak Haven Country Club Alliance. Service: agricultural. Transit volume: amount: $85,000. Month. Thomas frowned, adjusting his glasses. The Oak Haven Country Club Alliance? That's a coalition of 5 private, high-end golf resorts on the other side of the county. Why are they paying Whispering Pines $85,000 a month? And what the hell is agricultural transit volume? I asked. Thomas's eyes widened. He grabbed the paper, practically shoving his nose into the spreadsheet. He jumped up, bolted to his filing cabinet, and yanked out the original pipeline blueprints that Richard Covington had used to justify the easement through my ranch. "Arthur," Thomas breathed, his voice trembling with excitement. "When they forced that pipeline through your property, they claimed it was strictly for emergency utility transit to their own reservoir. They claimed the water was strictly to save their own golf course." "Right. That was the whole basis of the judge granting them the easement," I agreed. "Look at the schematic for their reservoir station." Thomas pointed to a tiny, easily overlooked set of secondary pipes branching off their main holding tank. "They didn't just build a reservoir, they built a commercial transfer hub." The realization hit me like a freight train. "They were selling it," I whispered. "Exactly," Thomas shouted, slamming his fist on the desk. Whispering Pines wasn't just watering their own lawns. They had secretly tapped into a massive mountain aquifer, piped it down through your private land under the guise of a municipal emergency, and then quietly sold millions of gallons of it to 5 other elite country clubs across the county. It was a staggering $1 million commercial water brokering operation, and it was completely illegal. Not only had they committed commercial theft by selling water from a property they didn't own, but they had also committed perjury. They had lied to the judge who granted the easement. "You cannot use an emergency utility easement to run a for-profit commercial liquid export business." "Thomas," I grinned, feeling the heavy weight of the past month evaporate from my shoulders. "Can we prove this?" "Prove it?" "Arthur, they documented it in their own financial ledgers to keep their board of directors happy. Winston Carmichael probably didn't even look closely at the accounting documents before handing them over in discovery." Thomas was already dialing his phone. "I'm calling Judge Peterson's chambers. We are requesting an immediate emergency hearing. We aren't just going to get their lawsuit thrown out, Arthur. We are going to dismantle their entire association." The trap had been sprung. Richard Covington thought he was playing chess while I was playing checkers, but he hadn't realized I just flipped the entire board over. The Oak Haven County Courthouse was a towering, century-old building of limestone and mahogany, a place where generations of ranchers and developers had battled over dirt and water. On the morning of our emergency hearing, the air in courtroom 302 was thick with tension. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my calloused hands resting flat on the polished wood. Next to me, Thomas Abernathy looked like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. He was casually adjusting his tie, entirely unbothered by the glare coming from the defense table. A few feet away, Richard Covington was whispering fiercely to his lead counsel, Winston Carmichael. Richard wore a bespoke charcoal suit and a sneer that suggested he was merely enduring a minor inconvenience. He firmly believed this was the day a judge would force me to surrender my mountain and turn his precious water back on. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Theodore Peterson took the bench. Judge Peterson was a no-nonsense man in his late 60s, a former cattleman himself, with a reputation for mercilessly punishing anyone who wasted his court's time. "All right, let's get down to business," Judge Peterson grumbled, adjusting his reading glasses. "Mr. Carmichael, your firm filed an emergency motion demanding the forced reactivation of a water pump on private property. You claim the defendant, Mr. Pendleton, maliciously disrupted an established municipal utility Care to elaborate? Winston Carmichael stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced arrogance. Yes, Your Honor. The Whispering Pines Utility District acted in good faith to secure a water source during a county-wide drought emergency. We were granted a transit easement by this very court. Mr. Pendleton subsequently purchased the land, holding the water source in a vindictive attempt to extort my clients. We are asking for immediate injunctive relief to restore water flow, as the landscaping damages to the community are accumulating at an alarming rate of $10,000 a day. I see, Judge Peterson muttered, making a note. Mr. Abernathy, your client bought a mountain just to turn off a valve? Thomas stood up, holding a single manila folder. Your Honor, my client purchased the Clearwater Basin legally at a county tax auction to protect his ranch. However, the reason we requested this emergency hearing is not about property rights. It is about fraud, perjury, and the gross abuse of the judicial system by the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Carmichael scoffed loudly. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is throwing wild accusations to distract from his client's illegal tampering. Overruled, Judge Peterson said, leaning forward, his interest clearly piqued. You have the floor, Mr. Abernathy. Make it good. Your Honor, 3 months ago, Mr. Covington stood in this courtroom and swore under oath that his subdivision required an emergency utility easement through my client's ranch to prevent the collapse of their municipal landscaping. Thomas stated smoothly, passing copies of a thick document to the bailiff, who handed them to the judge and to Carmichael. He claimed the water was exclusively for the Whispering Pines Reservoir, but that was a lie. Richard Covington's face twitched. Carmichael quickly flipped through the pages, his smug expression faltering. I direct Your Honor's attention to page 47 of the defendant's own financial disclosures, subpoenaed during discovery, Thomas continued, his voice ringing clearly through the silent courtroom. You will see a recurring monthly revenue line item of $85,000 from the Oak Haven Country Club Alliance, labeled Agricultural Transit Volume. We have also included the unredacted engineering blueprints for the HOA's reservoir, which clearly show commercial distribution pipes bypassing their holding tanks entirely. Judge Peterson's eyes narrowed as he read the highlighted sections. The silence in the room was deafening. Whispering Pines wasn't trying to save their lawns, Your Honor, Thomas thundered. They used this court to force a pipeline through a private, working cattle ranch so they could illegally extract water from an abandoned aquifer and sell it for profit to 5 separate luxury golf resorts. They used an emergency municipal easement to run an unregulated, commercial water brokering business. The color completely drained from Richard Covington's face. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. Winston Carmichael frantically whispered to him, but Richard just stared straight ahead, frozen in terror. Judge Peterson slowly lowered the documents. When he looked up, the fury in his eyes was absolute. Mr. Carmichael, the judge's voice was dangerously quiet. Did your client use an emergency court order to install a commercial pipeline on private property? Your Honor, the interpretation of the utility charter, Carmichael started, sweating profusely. Do not play semantics with me in my courtroom, Judge Peterson roared, slamming his gavel down so hard it echoed like a gunshot. Your client perjured himself. He lied to this court to secure an injunction trespassed on Mr. Pendleton's land and engaged in the unauthorized commercial sale of natural resources. This is not just a civil violation. This is criminal fraud. The judge turned his blazing glare directly onto Richard. The emergency easement granted to the Whispering Pines Utility District is hereby permanently revoked, Judge Peterson ruled, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. Mr. Covington, I am ordering your crews to immediately unearth and remove every single inch of pipe from Mr. Pendleton's property at your association's sole expense. You will restore his pasture to its exact original condition. Furthermore, I am forwarding these financial ledgers to the district attorney's office with a strong recommendation for a criminal fraud investigation. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Thomas clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, grinning from ear to ear. But Thomas wasn't done. Your Honor, regarding the damages my client suffered, the destruction of his grazing land, the legal fees, and the emotional distress caused by this fraudulent pipeline. Judge Peterson nodded sharply. I am entertaining a motion for treble damages, Mr. Abernathy. File the paperwork. I have a feeling the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association is about to become very familiar with bankruptcy proceedings. The aftermath was a glorious, chaotic spectacle. The massive fines, combined with our civil lawsuit for commercial theft and property destruction, completely bankrupted the Whispering Pines HOA. Their fancy legal fund was drained in weeks. Richard Covington was forced to resign in disgrace, and shortly after, he was indicted by the county for commercial fraud. He ultimately pleaded down, but he lost his Mercedes, his house, and his country club membership. It took 2 months, but I sat on my porch with Boomer, the blue heeler, and watched the same yellow excavators return to my pasture. This time, they weren't digging a trench to steal my land. They were painstakingly pulling massive, black PVC pipes out of the dirt. Under the strict supervision of a court-appointed agricultural inspector, they refilled the trench with premium topsoil, reseeded the entire lower valley with high-grade pasture grass, and built me a brand new, reinforced steel fence. The settlement money I won from the lawsuit was life-changing. I easily paid off the massive loans I took out to buy Clearwater Basin, securing the mountain completely debt-free. With the remaining funds, I upgraded my grandfather's aging farm equipment, expanded my cattle herd, and put a solid safety net in the bank. The spring up in the basin remains untouched to this day. I go up there sometimes, just to sit by the crystal clear water and listen to the wind in the pines, breathing in the sweet scent of absolute victory. The golf course next door eventually turned completely brown, an expensive, overgrown reminder that you never, ever mess with a rancher's land. And that's the story of how an arrogant HOA president tried to steal my ranch's water and ended up completely destroying his own luxury community. If you loved hearing this corrupt country club get legally dismantled, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next real-life revenge story. Have you ever dealt with a crazy, entitled HOA? Tell me in the comments below.